Welcome back. You're watching Your World at 10. Now, earlier this week, Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman wrote in his New York Times column that the U.S. is headed towards a third depression if the government does not sanction more stimulus measures. Harvard University professor and author Niall Ferguson, who wrote the book Ascent of Money and It's a Keeper, has been a fierce critic of Krugman's theories over the last year. He joins us now from London to give us his view of what's going on in the developed economies. Niall, thank you so much for your time. Let me start by asking you where you stand on the debate of austerity versus stimulus, a debate that was at the center of the G20 talks that was on the weekend that has passed, and also a debate that's at the center of Paul Krugman's column this week, where he says that if the US doesn't push for more stimulus measures, then it's quite likely that the US will be in what he calls a third depression.
Krugman seems to be vying with Nouriel Roubini for the title of Dr. Doom in talking about a Great Depression. It seems to me this is a false dichotomy. It's not that we have some kind of choice between Keynesian fiscal stimulus for years to come or austerity on the other side. It seems to me that the Keynesian option is a finite one. In Europe, that option basically is at an end. As the Greeks discovered, if you try to borrow 10% of GDP year after year, at some point the bond market calls time, and then you find yourself in a death spiral of rising interest rates and growing deficits. And the only alternative at that point is to try to balance your budget over a period of years. So I don't think the Keynesian option is one that is going to be there for much longer, even in the United States. And I do think that Paul Krugman has consistently underestimated the risks of this kind of massive fiscal profligacy. Right now, the US is on course to have trillion-dollar deficits for the rest of time, and that's just not credible. The key choice really is between measures that impose austerity through higher taxes, which depress business confidence and drive economies ever deeper into depression, or, on the other side, measures that stimulate business confidence by cutting wasteful public expenditure and incentivizing businesses to hire and expand. And that's the real choice that Europe and, I believe, the whole Western world now faces.
And now that's a tough balance to strike as well, right? Of what you see of what's going on within not just EU countries but also across Europe. Do you feel encouraged that maybe we've passed the threat of a sovereign debt crisis as was looming in the early part of this year? Or do you feel that we're still standing at the edge of a precipice?
I'm afraid the sovereign debt crisis has been postponed rather than solved. I've just been in Greece, in fact, over the last few days, and it does seem to me highly unlikely that the Greek government will be able, with the best will in the world, to deliver on its commitments, to reduce its deficit by 10 percentage points of GDP in just a few years, with the debt burden heading up towards 150% of GDP. Even if everything goes according to plan, I think it's highly unlikely that this is going to be viable, with the Greek economy contracting at rates of up to 4% right now. So I'm afraid the sovereign debt crisis is still with us, and if anything, it's migrating, because right now the situation in Spain, not to mention Portugal, is giving real cause for concern. I sense that this crisis that's looming in the Spanish banking sector needs to be seen as part of a wider crisis of European banks, and many of these banks are in trouble precisely because they have exposure to sovereign debt, not just Greek debt, but also the debt of the other so-called pigs. So no, it ain't over in Europe, and I think there are going to be some very, very difficult decisions to be taken in the days and weeks ahead as we try to grapple with mounting doubt about the solvency of major financial institutions in Europe.
And do you see those tough decisions now being taken by various European countries? Because at least today we seem to have encouraging news come in from banks. The demand for a 3-month debt has been far lower than expected. The rollover is tomorrow. The stress tests are going on. You're saying that we seem to have postponed the sovereign debt crisis, not resolved it. Do you then expect an implosion of sorts over the next few months?
I think what governments need to be doing, and I include the United States in this, is coming up with credible plans to get back into fiscal equilibrium over 5 or at most 10 years. And the critical thing is not to front load this so much that you kill your economy. I think that's the mistake that really the Greeks have been forced to make. in their negotiations with the other European monetary union members. The thing about the UK budget, which we just saw last week, which impressed me, was that the emphasis was much more on cutting expenditure in the welfare side of government and maximising the incentives to business by phasing in a reduction in corporation tax. It's that kind of encouragement of the private sector that really we need to see, because if the private sector doesn't feel more confidence, if the incentives aren't there to take on new workers and expand operations, there never will be a sustained recovery. What you'll get is what they've got in Greece right now, which is a kind of permanent recession enforced by fiscal austerity.
And coming back to the US, Niall, you don't entirely agree with Paul Krugman, do you, that if there isn't further stimulus in the American economy, it could be headed into what he calls the third depression?
Well, the term depression is one that one has to use with great care. In the Great Depression, unemployment in the United States rose as high as 25%, which is more than double where it is right now, and gross domestic product contracted from peak to trough by a third. We're a very long way away from a situation as dire as that. I think it's much more realistic to talk about the dangers of a double-dip recession, or to be even more sanguine, a slowdown in the second half of 2010 in the United States. Now, that seems to me to be quite likely. The idea that we'll only avert a Great Depression by running ever larger stimulus programs is frankly nuts. In fact, if anything is going to really jeopardize the long-term prospects for US recovery, it's reckless fiscal policy at this point, which ultimately makes a Greek-style crisis 2 years down the line a reality for the United States. So I think we could do with a little bit more responsibility from commentators like Paul Krugman, sitting in the ivory tower of the New York Times or Princeton University. It's very easy to talk as if deficits don't matter, and you can run a $1 trillion deficit every year for years to come. The reality is that at some point any government, including the United States, will be called to account by skeptical bond investors, and then it will be ordinary people and small businesses that feel the pain, not academics with tenure at Ivy League universities.
All right, ivory tower indeed. A final question, Niall, to you, and this is on your new book, Financier. It's based on the life of Sir Sigmund Warburg. So why did you choose to write about him at this point in time, considering where we are in the global economy? I'm curious about that. And, of course, when do you think it'll hit India?
Well, we have some very important lessons to learn from financial history. That much must be clear to everybody. And Sigmund Warburg was a banker of a very different kind from the bankers that we see on Wall Street and in the City of London today. He died in 1982 after a life in which he had been responsible more than anybody was for rebuilding London as a financial centre. And Sigmund Warburg represented a very different approach to finance, in which relationships and trust were at a premium and transactions were really not the most important thing. Indeed, the interesting thing about Warburg was that he didn't really regard the P&L, the profit and loss bottom line, as the most important thing. For him, the key thing was to have high ethical standards, to maintain trust between clients and banks, and those are values which I would like to see revived in financial centres, not only in the West, but in Asia too. So he's an example, I think, which today's bankers would do very well to learn from.
All right, Niall, can't wait to have it here in India and read it. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you for joining us on Your World at 10. That's Niall Ferguson. I'm sure you've read The Ascent of Money. That's his very famous